Bonjour, everybody, and welcome. Sorry for not giving you time to breathe after the fantastic presentation we got from Aaron about auth in general. Right now, we are going to focus on something very specific, which is a scenario that you are all familiar with, but that you probably didn't spend much time thinking about. So today, unless you leave a room, I'm going to force you to think about it. My name is Victor Bertocci, and I was born in a small fishing village in a stormy evening. I'm not going to tell you anything about me because, one, you don't care. Two, all you need to know is I spent 20 years in this space caring about identity and developers. That's my only qualification. All right, so if you cannot stomach my accent, I'm going to give you a gift. I'm going to give you one slide in which I'm going to summarize the entire thing. At the end of the slide, if you want to leave, you can leave, and you will not lose much. OK, you have to do the movement, otherwise it doesn't work. So step-up authentication is what I define as a situation in which a user is already authenticated, have a session of some kind. The user attempts to access a resource, if for some reason, any reason, that resource decides that the type of authentication that was performed is not acceptable. And so that starts a chain of events that ends with the user being prompted for something different. And then if the user re-attempting the access and with some luck succeeding. That's step up. So I'm going to dig a bit into that. But that's what step up is. There is no standard guidance about this. Despite the fact that this is super common, there is no guidance. And that gentleman there, which is hiding behind the camera, is my partner in crime in suggesting a mechanism that can actually provide this scenario in a standard interoperable fashion. And like we chat all day on Slack instead of actually working, and we usually gossip. But sometimes we also say interesting, we were taking a picture, sorry. Say interesting things, and this is one of them. I call for other specs with him. And then basically what happened is that we proposed this thing at the ITF, and for some reason we were convincing, and the ITF, the OAuth working group, adopted this thing as a work item. And so now the work begins, and we will bounce back and forth and refine it. And once we reach consensus, if we ever, we're going to publish this thing. OK. Aaron, can I ask you to do like this when it's like 5 minutes left? Thank you. It has to be exactly like this. Otherwise, I will not acknowledge. OK, so the agenda is like really nothing very surprising. I'm going to talk a bit about why and how an authorization server identity provider prompts a user with a particular prompt. Then I'm going to dig a bit more in dynamic step-up authentication. If you go and search in literature, you will not find this. I am making stuff up because no one did before, and so I'm free to christen the concepts. And they will probably change as we do our discussion. And then, of course, I'm going to go into the details of our method, which mercifully is very simple. So I'm just going to be really fast and hopefully painless. So let's talk about authentication level drivers. Classic scenario, you have a client of some kind, you have one API, and you have an authorization server. You want to get a token for this API. And what you do is you send a request to the authorization server. In this particular case, I'm using the code flow. And I'm asking for the scope read appointments. This is from one class that we hold for our new employees. And the guy that helped me to put it together is somehow obsessed with dentists. So all of these examples are about dentists. And so this API is for reading appointments. And so that's the scope that we ask. We also ask for the scope offline access, which means we'll get a refresh token decoupled from the session. And then you see that there are a number of parameters there that are highlighted. For example, the scope intuitively represents very often some level of access that you want to achieve. And so it's very likely that the authorization server will take that into account when deciding how to prompt the user, what kind of challenges to show. The resource is a way of identifying the particular resource server. Again, that's an important scoping mechanism, which might determine the experience that the user gets. And there are others, but I'll tell in a second. So what happens is that now the authorization server makes a determination and says, you know what, I'm going to prompt you with username and password. And the user authenticates, and that thing is supposed to be a cookie and represents the fact that we established a session. Probably this session will have a reference to the type of authentication we performed. And we'll do our code dance, and we end up with an access token, and eventually also a refresh token. And then we just use our access token, and if we are lucky, we'll get access. Great. So this one is just like a refresher. Many of the things that I mentioned are already there, like scopes are something that determines the level of authentication you want, resources as well. User is an important parameter. I'm sure that many of you have those policies in which if a user is an admin or has power of attorney, no matter what resource they're asking for, they have to do MFA, for example. So that's a parameter. The identity of a client is controversial, mostly because a lot of the clients we have really aren't proving their own identity when they are asking for a token. All the public clients have no way of proving their identity. So please, please, please do not use the identity of a client for determining authorization policies, unless in some rare cases, if you're doing confidential clients, in which the client can actually prove its identity, then occasionally allowed, but proceed with caution. The important one, one of the important ones, is that last one, ACR values. ACR values is a parameter that was introduced by OpenID Connect, and substantially it represents a set of potential authentication methods that the authorization server decides make sense to be grouped together, like, for example, they all represent a certain level of authentication. And that parameter can be used in OpenID Connect to request that particular thing in that particular transaction. So if you actually attach these, there are a couple of methods because one would be too simple. And if you use one of those two methods, like, for example, you put it in the query string, then what happens is that the authorization server can take these into account and actually use that to determine the authentication experience. I know we are late, and earlier I got worried, so I'm full of adrenaline. I'm going really fast. Am I going too fast? Can you guys understand my accent? Are you sure? Very good. Thank you. All right. So step-up authentication can be, as the experience that I described earlier, can happen for a number of reasons. I'm going to give you the most classic reason, which is already addressed by the OAuth specifications. Like, in order to do the thing I'm going to show you, you don't need anything new. The thing is, no one does it, so that's usually a bad sign, but still. So let's say that now we want to make a call to this API, but the acute observers will notice that I'm using a post and not a GET. So this time, I am actually trying to either create or update an appointment. But if you remember, what we got earlier was only read appointments. So this thing fails, and it fails. OK, now I think Tim will yell at me because I'm using the bottom of the screen. But here, note that it's also clipped. So it's not only my fault. It's also the fault of the projector. So I am externalizing my guilt. So it's very unfortunate that it's in there. And so maybe I can. I'm very afraid of touching it because it might detonate. I don't know. But let me see if I can show you. Yep. Really? OK. So you can barely see it probably, but if you if you want to believe me, what's happening here is that we are sending back an error, which is defined by the Barrett token usage standard, in which we are declaring that the error that we are experiencing is insufficient scope. You are using a token that doesn't have enough scope. And what's happening is that we are actually specifying the scope we need. Here is we are saying you need to show up with write.appointment. Otherwise, don't bother. So now let's see if I manage to restart the presentation without demons coming out of the projection system. Seems okay. So, well, we got back. And so what happens is that now we go. Sorry. Yeah, it's here, but there is no highlight. Are you guys doing this on purpose? Like here, like we had a list of scopes, which here were supposed to actually have extra stuff. But okay, whatever. But anyway, here what's happening is that we are asking also for the extra scopes that we need. It was supposed to be in a different color, but whatever. And here, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time, but there are complications in this respect. Because if you want to be strict and do least privilege, in theory, you might want to have a token that has only the new scope. And instead, in this case, I'm being lazy, as it's my nature. And so I'm just adding also the former scopes so that I can actually obtain tokens that will have everything. And so I can actually use the new tokens for everything, which is a bad idea. Because right now, what might happen is that, I don't know what's going on. Sorry. The demons, after all, did show up. No? Sorry. I'm very sorry. Every time I have to do this again, but I have to stop at the right place. And every time I get to the wrong place. But anyway, what happens is that actually, now I'm asking for a different scope, and this is a statically defined policy. I can have a table, like auth doesn't tell you how to do this, but this problem is conducive of the authorization server having literally a table that says, if you do read username and password, if you do write, do WebAuthn, for example, but there might be other things. Like it might say, and this token lasts only 12 seconds. And so now if I get this new token and I use it for everything, now next time I try to do a read, I will actually be prompted again, which I don't want. So what happens here is that I get prompted for the new level. I perform my new authentication. I overwrite the cookie. And then I get back a set of new tokens. And I'm not deleting the old ones for the reason that I said earlier. Because when we say step up, we are actually saying a bit of a misnomer. Because this suggests that the new system is of higher value. The new method is higher than the old one. It's usually the case, but it's not strictly the case. So typically, the strategy is you should keep all the tokens as well. And of course, the happy ending is that we actually use the token, and it works. OK, so this one was what I call static step-up, because you can predict what will happen without looking at what's actually happening at runtime. But now, when you actually use a real system, and when you actually buy into the zero trust, continuous authentication, all of that stuff, you know that the resource server, the API, can decide at any time for any reason that they don't like that token, no matter what the authorization server thinks, whether that token should be good or not. You might have a risk engine that sees that that token came from a certain IP, and now the user just brought the laptop to Starbucks, and now it's a different IP. So sure, the token is still valid, but I don't like this. You've got to authenticate again. And that's entirely driven by the resource server. Or I might be buying something very, very expensive, so I might say, well, I'm uncomfortable with you making that purchase with just username and password. Those are all things that the resource server decides without the authorization server really knowing. Now, you could say, you know what? I'm going to create a set of scopes that represent the authentication levels. You could do that. But one, you don't have to. Remember that I mentioned earlier these ACR values? It's a claim, and it's a parameter that is already in the industry that a lot of people already support because it's OpenID Connect, so of course we already support it. So there's no point in creating those artificial scopes, one. Two, scopes might not be sufficient because sometimes the policy isn't I want a different method, is I want a new token. And so you want to be able to express things like freshness. That leads us to our approach. How am I doing with time? Sorry. 15 minutes, so I can slow down. No, I won't. Never mind. So our proposal is very simple. We are introducing a new error type, which is insufficient user authentication, which lives in parallel to the insufficient scopes, can be used in combination with insufficient scopes if necessary. And we introduce a couple of parameters which we can return as part of the error, which express what the resource server needs from the client so that it can actually authorize the request. Okay. And basically, this entails for us to ask the authorization server to support ACR values and max age, which it's already a reality for many authorization servers because nowadays it's rare for an implementation to be pure auth. It's usually auth with sprinkled some OpenID on top, and that's OpenID sauce. So, but formally, this thing is not in the ITF family of specs, so we do need to ask explicitly the authorization servers to do this. And as a mechanism to broadcast that is the case, we are extending the metadata of the authorization server so that it can declare, yes, I am that type of authorization server that your parents warned you about. I do support this particular error. Sorry, it's been a long day for me as well, so I'm relaxing a bit. I hope I won't relax too much, otherwise you'll cancel me. Okay, so Aaron mentioned earlier this JOT profile, which we worked on, which basically describes how to encode an access token using JOT in interoperable fashion. As part of all of that work, we introduced claims that can be used by the resource server to determine what was the ACR authentication level that was performed. So for that side, we are covered. There is another level, which is if you are validating your tokens using introspection, let's say that instead of asking for a format, you just send the token back home and say, is this yours? Do you know what it is done? And you basically ask, is it valid? Can you tell me what are the contents? And similar. We are going to propose extensions to this so that the response from the introspection endpoint can include the ACR claim, and it already includes the various dates, so we are covered in there. Also, this link is old because it still has my name in it. If the system would be more stable, I would click the link, and I'll show you that there is the actual official working part, but I'm terrified of doing it, so you'll have to believe me. OK, so here, let's do the dance. The dance starts with, I try to do high-value method. And here, let's say that I have a JOT, which doesn't specify any particular ACR. And let's say that my resource server says, well, sorry, in order to do this high-value thing, you have to do authentication based on my ACR. This thing is really hot. I think it's bad for my hair. And so what happens is that now the client is supposed to get those things and go back to the authorization server and ask for ACR. It's as simple as that. Just goes back to the authorization server, attaches the parameter, it's just right there. If I would have had also a max age, it would probably include the max age as well. And stuff happens. And eventually, I get back my token, which is the same token as before, but now it also says my ACR. Because the assumption here is that stuff happened means that the authorization server actually used whatever experience, whatever prompt authentication level is associated to that level was actually used to authenticate the user. And then at this point, we repeat our call, but happy ending, we get it to 100. Very good. All right, so why are we bothering to do this? Don't we have day jobs that we have to care about? We do. We are lucky. So the main reason is interrupt. Today, a lot of platforms already support this because it is a business requirement. But every time they'll do it in some different ways. And sometimes they'll do it in ways which is not very portable. Like, for example, some people jams the AMR, which is another parameter, which can specify a particular low-level method. But if you are in a multi-tenant environment, not every tenant might support it, so it breaks down. Or think you're writing an SDK, and you want to empower the API developer, which usually does not savor the experience of reading a stack of specifications to learn about auth. What they want is to just define some kind of easy policy and expect the client to be able to take advantage of those policies very easily, again, in the way that I just described. So that is the thing that we want. But here there is a bit of a bigger picture consideration, which is we have some mechanisms meant to support this. And you could use some other mechanisms, like some eventing system, to perform this, and in general, continuous authentication. But those systems typically are very powerful, but they require significant investment. This thing is bare bone. Like, the authorization server already supports it, apart from the metadata, with very few exceptions. The client doesn't have to do any magic. It just needs to read one parameter and include it in the next call. So call me optimist, and the people who know me know that it's not true. I'm usually the wet blanket on the room. But like, I think that this thing it's easy enough that it has the opportunity to be adopted, and with it, to bring the support to continuous authentication forward, which is something which is in the interest of all of us, because it will improve user experience, it will raise the security profile, because people will tolerate more. So lots of interesting advantages. So bottom line, just to summarize what you heard, dynamic step authentication is a very common scenario, and if we'll have an interop way of doing it, we'll be happy. So you are all experts, and although you also have day jobs, I'm sure that you can find in your heart to give back. And it's also in your interest, if you have a chance, to join the group and contribute to the discussion, mostly because once an RFC is done, it is done. So if your particular scenario is not a good fit with this thing, it will be too late. So if you recognize that this scenario is a scenario that you might be interested into, the time to engage is now. Thank you. I guess you might ask questions, but I see Tim, who is right behind me, and he is very, very upset about. One or two. Okay. Yes, sir.
What happens to the existing access token, and is this only temporary? Like, if you ask for offline access, will that mean like?
The question is, what happens to the existing access token? As I mentioned earlier, it's going to depend on your scenario. In the general case, you should probably keep both, mostly because the new token might have characteristics that either not all the scopes that you had before, or you might actually end up with a bad experience if, for example, it's a shorter-lived token.
What about the refresh token? If there is an offline access also as part of that?
What happens to the refresh token? The refresh token is representative of a session, so you will get the new refresh token with a new session.
Now the new scope, or it's only tied to the original?
I'm sorry, but I cannot hear. Let's do it offline, so I can take the second question.
So step-up operations are usually one-time type things, right? I mean, often very sensitive, something only happen once. Is there anything built in the spec to prevent somebody from doing something multiple times during a short window?
The question is, normally this happens only once. Is there anything in the spec that prevents doing this multiple times? There isn't, mostly because we don't know if the intended outcome is to do this multiple times. Perfect. Thank you.